Your very first novel, Halloween Rain, which again, like so much of your work, has a definite kind of hard horror edge to it. You had to fill in some gaps because obviously, as you said, the show had just begun airing. You were reading scripts, and you had to kind of fill in blank spots. And one thing you did in there that I thought was a nice touch, that as far as I'm concerned should be canon, is you explain why Willow has redder hair as the show goes on. I don't know if you were even thinking about that at the time, but you had her dress as Agent Scully for a Halloween party, and she liked being a redhead. And of course, on the show, they never explained why she went from having sort of chestnut hair to red. And I thought, well, it's explained in that book perfectly.
Thank you.
It should just be accepted as canon.
I'm with you. I'm totally with you. The other, of course, we made the big blunder. We figured Halloween would be the Super Bowl for the vampires, and of course, it turned out not to be. And that happened a lot to us, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not on purpose. We would say something, and they would say, no, it's not going to be that way. And sometimes it would be that way, and sometimes they'd change it. So the reality of the canon was often a moving target for us. Mm-hmm. So that's where we actually suggested the idea of freezing a story and saying in the book what the continuity would be. Because it takes 6 to 9 months for a book to come out from New York, and the episodes are every week. Mm-hmm. So we're like writing over here, and all the episodes are coming up. Most of the time we knew what was going to happen next, but a lot of times we were surprised. We never knew that Angel's name was Liam until it was on the show, and we never knew what Oz's name was Danny Osborne. Mm-hmm. We never knew that. So when it would come up, we'd like, what? What? And then people would write, Amazon, well, obviously Holder and Golden never watched Buffy, or they don't really know the show. Right. But we'd written this book like maybe a year before, so that was one of the challenges.
And of course, things aren't necessarily all that hard and fast on the show itself. They would contradict themselves as time went on.
Exactly.
Yes. Anything specific that you can recall where you came up with something for a book and Fox said, no, you absolutely cannot do that?
Yes, a couple times. We wanted to have a dark Slayer, and they said, no, there's going to be one. And it was, of course, Eliza Dushku. And then I had written a book called Blood and Fog. And in that book, the big bad was the first. And it got pretty far into the publishing process before somebody said, we're going to do the first, we're going to use the first. And so it became Jack the Ripper. But it was the first. And so I had to go back. And the Dark Slayer, I had a book called I think it was The Evil That Men Do. And that was supposed to be a dark Slayer, and it got permuted because Faith was going to come along. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, The Evil That Men Do is a book I want to touch upon because very often in your work, Willow is in peril. That is a strong theme, and it's one that I think the readers respond to. But in this one, I believe she gets shot.
Yeah.
But you also introduce a very interesting character named Helen,
right,
who turned out to be the Willow of ancient Rome to that era's Slayer, who in fact was sired as a vampire and wound up killing that Slayer. And what I think is the most perfectly gruesome touch, uses her skull as a cup. But characters like that, since the Buffy characters in a way are so static and there's only so much you can do, how much fun is it just to create these off-the-wall villains for them to go up against?
It is really fun, and that's a really good point, is a lot of times we can't really touch what happens to the main characters. After when I wrote The Queen of the Slayers, I killed Kennedy in the original draft and had to take it out. But things like that, where you get to make up a guest star villain or something, that's the really fun part. Mm-hmm. An interesting thing about that book was it was going to come out 2 weeks after Columbine. And as, I hate to tell you this, it seems so shallow, but as I was watching the footage of Columbine on TV, my first words were, my Buffy book!
Yes.
Because it was it was much closer in the original draft. Mm-hmm. And Simon & Schuster had an emergency meeting about it, and they decided to table the book for a year. And I had to rewrite the beginning, because it was a kid going to school, shooting everybody, and then killing himself in the library, which is exactly what happened at Columbine. And I'm glad they did all the deferring and changing, because it turns out, I didn't realize it at the time, I have a girlfriend whose daughter was at Columbine.
Really?
And she had student friends who were killed, and she was in therapy for over a year over it. So I'm glad that it happened, but I'm so embarrassed now. I was watching it and went, my Buffy book, instead of, oh my God, this is horrible. I'm like, my Buffy book.
Well,
So-
you're passionate about what you write.
Well,
It's
thank
part
you.
of your life. And I'll have to say, the way you wrote it out, it didn't seem like it was exploiting any of the tragedies. It really brought home the horror of what that's like. And I think even when we see these things unfold on TV, there's sort of unreality about it. And we have such a love affair with guns and violence in this
Yeah.
country, and with the video games, that we don't think about the loss of life. And the way you wrote it really brings out the stark fear and the horror that comes out. And I encourage anyone who hasn't read the book yet to pick it up. And coincidentally, of course, the Buffy season that year had an episode, Earshot, scheduled
Right,
to air,
right.
I believe that week or the following week, that had a school shooting.
Yep.
And
Same thing.
yeah, so
Well, there's an amazing, I'm sure you know, I'm pretty sure it's been on the websites about the big Slayer academic community. And they have a conference every other year now.
Mhm.
And there was a big paper presented on Buffy and guns. And I went to the panel, the presentation, it was amazing. If you think about the use of guns in Buffy and not in Buffy,
Mhm.
And Debbie and I right now, when we're writing our vampire series, we have had a lot of discussion about, do they have guns, do they not have guns? Darla had guns.
Yes.
And then, of course, Tara gets shot. So how are guns used and why aren't guns used? It's really a fascinating whole thing that's going on.
although the guns are used far more prevalently in the new season 8 comic book.
Yeah.
Yeah, which seems a little unsettling. Seems a little too paramilitary for me.
Well, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And I think that in the presentation, the academic person who wrote the paper posited that part of it was that Buffy is sort of a timeless heroine. Like the quarterstaff thing and all the swords and all that is more of almost like an honorable troubadour warrior kind of quest thing going on. Versus
Can I share my
Vampire.
theory with you?
Yes.
That she's very much like King Arthur, but instead of being brought back to life, keeps coming back in life to life. And you would not expect King Arthur to have a gun.
Right.
King Arthur will
That would
always
be
have
cool.
Excalibur. Buffy is this, as you say, timeless warrior, a part of a long string who always used the weapons
Right.
that they had in the past.
Well, and Giles even says that, like, you have to use this quarterstaff. It's hello, Giles, 20th century, and, all that.
Yeah. Although I think it's amusing how every vampire comes back with mad kung fu skills.
I know. What is up? Some of them are very erudite and have their heads, and some of them are just monsters.
Yes.
So I like that too.
Yeah.
It's kind of a parallel for our times.
Wow, I wonder if Josh was planning that.
Probably so.
So you probably have written, if not the most amount of Buffy and Angel books, probably near close
I think
to it.
I have written those.
Around 24 or
A
so
lot.
short stories, full novels, collaborations, including one you're not credited for by your choice. That would be the Chosen adaptation.
Chosen is sort of me, sort of not me. Chosen went in real fast. The editorial got dropped. I don't want to go into it too much. It's not completely my thing. And so they said, do you feel like your name should be on this? And I said, no, I don't think I should be. This is not mine. But they left all my dedications and things in it.
Yes.
So, in a lot of places it doesn't list it as one of my books, and it's not listed on my website.
Although, strangely, I don't know if it's still the case, but for the longest time when you went to Amazon and you called up the book, the copy of the cover had your name on it, although obviously they
How
didn't print anything
interesting.
like that.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I will say, for people who haven't read it, it's a difficult read simply because it's like they ran it through spell check, and spell check didn't recognize a lot of words and
Right.
just made some strange corrections.
Yeah.
I call it the intern edited book because I don't know who else handled it, but you do some really fun things in there. Most specifically, and I think a lot of Xander fans will appreciate this, you give him an internal monologue at the end when he finds out Anya has died. First of all, just personally, what they did with Xander the last couple seasons to me was a travesty, but you gave him back some dignity and a connectedness to Anya that the show denied. I want to thank you as a Xander fan.
Yeah, I'm a Xander fan.
Yeah, and he got to be Xander one more time
Yeah,
with that,
yeah.
and it was
Well,
nice.
thank you.
So,
you.
Do you have a favorite among any of them?
No. Yes and no.
But they're all your kids, right?
It's kind of like what was going on in my life at different points, and I think always, I love being a writer and I love writing, but I was always kind of edgy, or am edgy, writing about Buffy because I admire it so much, and I admire Joss Whedon so much that I always was nervous about coming up short. And so it was almost like I was trying to please Dad. You know, I wanted to really do a good job. I just wrote an essay for a book called Whedonistas.
Yes.
And I loved it, and I loved doing it. It seemed so amazing that I got to do it. I didn't think we'd get the job when we turned in our ideas for the first novel. I didn't think we'd get to do it because it would be so cool. And it's so sad because my co-author now, Debbie, she expects things to go well, and I'm always braced for the bad news. And so I thought, I want this so much that I'm afraid I won't get it. And I felt that way and have felt that way writing the books. I want this to be really, really good, and I'm afraid it might not be. So when I look at the covers, I remember different things like how old my daughter was or what happened, and I have memories from different books. But the books themselves, I love all of them, and it's just an aggregate of it's almost like one huge book for me. It's almost like, I'm sure Joss has favorite episodes, but the whole series is his thing.
Right.
And that's kind of how I feel about all the stuff I wrote.
Well, it sounds like you keep your edge as a writer. You don't get too complacent. You don't think, well, I could just write anything and it's going to be fine. So
It's gotten worse. I've gotten slower and more self-conscious as life has gone on. And I got very self-conscious after I started going to the academic conferences because they present their papers and then they cite their research. And they would read them aloud to the group. So they'd say, as we see in Holder, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, you know, I was an original source, and I just go kind of, people go and smile at me, and I just go like, oh my God. It's like, oh, they really read it, you know. People really read these. So it made me very self-conscious, and the internet has just made it worse. Because you can go on Amazon and get a review, and then people comment on if they liked the review or didn't like it, and I'm like, ugh.
yes.
It makes you really, I feel very fishbowl. So.
And writing is such a solitary profession anyway, so I would think that sometimes when you come to something like this conference you're at today, surrounded by so many other authors, it could be intimidating, but I also think you're intimidating to them. You have such an incredible body of work, and there are some people who spend 5, 6, 7 years writing their next book.
Right.
And you write regularly.
I write a lot. I do.
I mean, how many in the last 5 years alone?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I honestly don't know.
Is that great that you could say you don't know?
Debbie and I are finishing our book right now. It's due next Friday. So yeah. I was writing on the plane, writing in my hotel room, and yeah.
So I can see how you might intimidate some authors.
Well, thank you. I hope
and of course,
so.
you're such a fearsome personality
That's
anyway,
it.
and frightening. And
That's me.
let's talk about something you just published recently, and that is Crusade. I'm going to tell you a real quick story about that. I went to Washington last week, and it was an early flight, so I had to get up crack of dawn. So I said, I'll sleep on the plane, and I'll bring a book just to nod off to as I read. So I brought Crusade, and I opened it up, and as cliche as it sounds, right from the first page, it explosively hits the ground running. I did not sleep on that flight.